just a brief round of applause. In fact, if we refer back to for those who attended our previous discussion, I just want to continue a bit on Prof. Nadir's comment on the impact of Fazlur Rahman's work, particularly in this region, in Malaysia and Indonesia. What was also touched in our previous discussions, this misconception about the liberals, or the understanding about liberalism here in Malaysia. In fact, because I did a study for my master's thesis, is on mainly understanding the so-called liberal Muslims. In fact, I also interviewed Dr. Farooq in that thesis, and of course Marina Mahathir and a few other figures usually being associated to liberal thinking. We understand it fully that there is a serious misconception on how the term liberal is being coined, but what made it more serious is, based on such misconception, this term is being turned into not just a fatwa, it later being turned into a law which is gazetted. So meaning that how misconceptions later being turned into law, there's a lot of problems there. But in part of my effort to understand during the introduction this misconception of the liberals, a simple narrative which I could come up with on how does the discourse which is misconceived to be as liberals, meaning that the progressive and critical perspective of Muslims' views talk about democracy, human rights, gender equality. When we refer back to organizations, one, there is some close relations between the discourse in Malaysia and Indonesia. How does this actually happen? It relates to intellectually through a few organizations as Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, and also the Jaringan Islam Liberal as well, but at the same time the political events, mainly because Indonesia had the Reformation in 1997, and within that process there's a lot of Indonesian political activists who are also highly intellectual came to Malaysia, and there happened to be an active discussions on political reform. And part of the political reform also includes the matters on human rights, on liberty and democracy. And among the Islamic discourse, Fazlur Rahman's name is among the top, which is being referred on how the transition of discourse happened to take place. So that also explains on the importance of Fazlur Rahman when it comes to promoting the discourse of progressive Islam in Malaysia. Unfortunately, later turned out to be called liberal Islam. So that is another different issue. So anyway, I think I would like to open. Perhaps before I open, I think it is going to be very interesting if you can hear from
Fazlur Rahman students. Yes, this is a special treat.
I was a bad student.
At least some personal sharings on the process.
Sure. Thank you so much for your lecture. It brought so many memories back. You explained it very well. I agree with everything.
You said almost.
The almost is because I think you touched at the end the idea of social justice, social economic justice. Like I think Rahman also saw the idea that religion had become narrowed down. The major problem, although he started with the idea of revelation and reason, trying to introduce reason and all that, but in the later on it was more of the how do you correct the social economic field. Muslims have become, in a way, Muslim intellectuals have become so very elitist. We discuss only elitist issues. I mean, whether we discuss certain laws, but we don't talk about redistribution of wealth anymore. Where he keeps arguing that the Prophet wanted to promote human dignity, and human dignity has to do with economic justice. And this part was always emphasized over and over again. So as you kept talking about
by him.
Yes. I mean, in the article Economics in Islam, and numerous other articles on even socialism in Islam to a certain extent. There was an article, I can't remember exactly, but throughout the book, it's always an idea that Islam wanted to create an egalitarian society. He wanted to bring everyone up and making each other responsible. And somehow we've narrowed religion to a pietistic, as you put it that way. And of course, the rest of it was perfect. I mean, the one you explained on how law and everything else was, he made man central again. And this idea of ethics becomes very central. But the question is, what do we understand as ethics? We have narrowed ethics to, put certain things. But we totally forgot, even when this project in Malaysia about Islamic economics doesn't talk about redistribution, doesn't talk about poverty, doesn't talk about anything. None of these. It's just either riba-free banking, and even that's a joke in a way, to an extent, but that's it. So it fails to understand the project of trying to develop an egalitarian society. Most of them would argue this is a socialist idealism, but it was never that the case. As the Prophet tried to bring everyone up. So the concept of shura is not only to be for the educated, but to bring those uneducated to become educated, to enter and participate in the field. But this, I agree with what is disappointing with the Islamic movements, and actually many, or even the Islamic movements in the West, is it has somehow become an elitist project. This liberal, I'm sorry, I cannot agree with liberal, jaringan liberal Islam. What it does is issues have actually trivialized Islam, where, it's LGBT that we talk about, homosexual. Well, you're not talking about actually the general public who's actually suffering, who's now, what about them? You're talking about a few elites, and you make that as if that's the key issue. So even your issue of polygamy was an issue. That's an idea of, because it affects a lot of people, and it's the idea of people being equal. That's the main. That's the framework. So how do we do this? I think Rahman. Problem with Rahman only is that he's a little too harsh. He speaks his mind, and he doesn't, as you said, he doesn't compromise. He doesn't suffer fools. And at times, because he does that, sometimes people have a hard time trying to follow him. Unless you take time to try to understand it, then you will. But once if you just start reading it as if, Islamic history is all problematic. There doesn't seem to be any solutions. He gave this. I try to shock people. He says, I do try to shock people because they need to wake up, and they're not waking up. And unless I write like this, and he's willing to suffer for his writings. That's amazing. The courage of conviction is amazing. But as I said, I believe most of his writings try to argue for this argument for human dignity. Religion is creating human dignity. And that's why when the discussion yesterday on Islam should mean to promote these things, not against these things. You should, if you argue yourself as a Muslim, you should be compassionate about other people. You should bring up people up, not the other way around. But now we have why Islam has become so narrowed. I don't understand, and I can't see a solution to it. I do understand. The argument first was create a more rational approach, create a more egalitarian, a more ethical approach rather than a legalistic approach. But that third step, as it comes from mostly an elitist view. Most of the intellectuals are elitists, and they talk to elitists, and therefore it's hard for them to talk about bringing a redistribution of things and wealth, etc. It doesn't sell. In Indonesia, however, it always the Indonesian movement started as Syarikat Islam, the Islamic company. Actually, the Islamic movement started off as a business entity, and always emphasized redistribution of wealth. And that's why I know I've met Nurhalis. I know Shafi quite well. They've always come with this. They've always dealt with an issue of, because they suffer, they were poor. And they know the suffering of the poor, and therefore it was not accidental that they went to Chicago. They actually chose to study under Rahman.
Right. Oh, really?
Yes. Amin Rais was mostly under Binder, but he did do some classes with Rahman. But Nurhalis and Shafi basically did choose. They had choices of going to different places. But the attraction of this idea of social economic justice and equality was the mainstream. How you would do that today, I really don't know.
In fact, I would like just to continue a bit from why is it reading this book, Islam, was something really changed my understanding and mindset at the end, the whole overall understanding of Islam. Because before reading this book, I was mainly the knowledge or understanding of Islam is mainly being shaped by the lectures, the kuliah, the classes, and which is the tendency one is very dogmatic. It's just very one way. The teacher says one thing, and you just follow. That's my focus on doctrines, on matters on ibadah and the basic creeds. The things that we, during our education in classes, I think this is shared with a lot of friends studying in formal Islamic educations, we don't have the chance to contest, question, and try to understand matters. Just accept it for it is. In fact, as if there is a phase that you don't need to understand about religious knowledge. It's something you just accept. So,
but not the problem with the book, but the book, for someone who doesn't know very much and starts reading the book, you start seeing you have a very holier than thou attitude of what happened in the past. It was everybody was perfect. We have this perception. The book starts to tell you about the wars, the fights, the debates, the whatever, right? And suddenly, oh, are you telling me Islam is not what I know now? It is for many discomforting. I mean, the major themes are beautiful. Major themes has no problem. But the Islam, you'll have to have some deeper knowledge and not deeper knowledge, but in the sense that you would have some discomfort. Suddenly realizing that your history is not all that great. People were fighting. There were a lot of disagreements, and somehow these things have.
The whole period of the Khulafa Rashidun, we have a romanticized version of it,
We've got such a romanticized.
But when you look at actually what was happening, and you read it, oh my God, my daddy didn't tell me this. It was a much more complex situation.
And you I mean, you break the cherry or you lose. But do you replace it with something else? That's the issue. So now the person's now given, Rahman basically puts it on your shoulders. Now you got to do something with it. I can bring you so far, but now you got to do something. Now the problem that for many people would be very discomforting.
So before Quranic respond, so the way it is being put by Rahman is that it is not really a book which explains what is Islam is all about, what the Aqidah aspect, the Ibadah aspect. But first of all, it explains the way it's narrated. It is chronological, meaning that it starts with history, how Islam emerged, and then the important developments of Islam. It touched on politics, why is it the politics at the current time in a way developed to be something like this compared to before, and the development of the tradition of the scholars, when it comes to the law, the philosophical development, how does it relate to the mystics, to the Sufis, the education, and also the process of modernist Islam developments, and to the more recent, because I think this book was written in the late 1970s. So it ended up during the time of, I recall towards the end he mentioned quite a few times the ideas of reformist thinkers, including Abdul, Iqbal, in terms of how to address the current recent challenges. So when I read this book, it is out of, I didn't know all these kind of things, even though after learning 10 years in schools. And what is usually being repeated in either in the usual kuliah or in other classes is more or less like the same thing which we've already learned without addressing the new other alternative information that is important for the understanding of Islam. So that is why it's something which is very enlightening to me at that time and continuously helped in shaping my later views. Perhaps Dr. Nadir will contribute.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that one of the challenges facing Muslim communities is that if you're a young student growing up and you wanted to understand something about your religious heritage, your identity, you go to the mosque, you attend some sort of prayer group or study group, you start to go to an Islamic bookstore, you're not going to encounter Fazlur Rahman. The imam who has religious authority is going to be preaching an interpretation of Islam that is very different than what Fazlur Rahman was articulating. And so this has consequences in terms of young people growing up and being exposed to a particular traditional, or what I would argue, a Salafi Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, fundamentally produces more problems than it solves. It produces a lot of these. So the challenge is, how do you make Fazlur Rahman's ideas more accessible, more exposed? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I think one of the answers is the Islamic Renaissance front. Groups have to start, translating his books, disseminating them, promoting them. I mean, that's one thing that can be done. I know other groups in the United States are trying to keep Fazlur Rahman's memory alive. And it's a deep tragedy, when you go to, a friend of mine went to a bookstore in Birmingham, England, and tried to do a content analysis of the books that were on sale in that particular bookstore, which was attached to a mosque, and 80% of them came from a Salafi Wahhabi background. And that's representative, and so, these kids, they want to, and they think this is the only Islam that's there. If you try and tell them that, look, well, actually there is more ethical interpretations, more, modernist interpretations. Most young Muslims growing up in societies around the world will be completely alien to that experience. And so you're right, part of the challenge is that, as was mentioned, Fazlur Rahman is an intellectual. He is a professor. His ideas and his books are really geared toward, this book on Islam and modernity is not a book that you can go to the mosque and give someone to read. It's written for an academic audience, for an intellectual audience. It presupposes a background and an ability to read a dense book like this. I think Major Themes, though, is actually the one book that can easily be read by any Muslim with just a basic level of literacy, and they can, I think, really appreciate the approach and how unique and fresh it is, and how ethical and how modern it is at the same time. So this is, I think, the one book that does have, and I'm really glad that it came out in a second edition that makes it more accessible and keeps it alive.
One question, across the Muslim majority world, ideas like this, do you think they're already there? Do you think they are, marginalized? Do you think, there are some societies which are more, more open to these ideas, Muslim societies, or are they all the same?
Basically,
Across the Muslim world?
My own view is that most of them are the same because of the prevalence of the dominance of a traditional narrative, which was rote learning, which was reading the Quran in piecemeal, which is a very anti-modernist,
entrenched,
and deeply entrenched. Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges of modernity is you have to try and transform tradition. There has been a traditional interpretation of Islam that has deep historical roots. If you wanted to be an imam or an Islamic expert, you would go to the traditional schools, either in Al-Azhar, Saudi Arabia, or if you're a Shia Muslim, you'd go to Qom or to Najaf, and you would get a traditional education. And that traditional education is completely different than what Fazlur Rahman is arguing. You wouldn't be exposed to this. So in many ways, he is articulating a new interpretation, a new theory, and the only people that I think really get exposed to it are people that happen to overlap with an experience where you are living in the West, or you have some modern experience. You know where the University of Chicago is. You know that University of Chicago Press have published these books. These books, as far as I know, I don't know if these books have actually even been translated into Arabic. Is Islam and Modernity translated into Arabic? I suspect not.
So his ideas won't have any currency here.
They won't, yeah.
They're
too shocking.
They would. From my perception.
You have to understand the romanticized version of Islam is very comforting.
Yeah.
Especially when you have you feel the colonial experience, the Muslims feel now that they're being oppressed and all that.
Yeah.
So at least in the past it was great. The whole idea was the past didn't have the problems.
Yeah.
The past was all black and white.
Yeah.
So for many people who go to the masjids and all that, they don't want a version which suddenly you said there are caveats here, there are problems there. When you start talking about people actually like human beings struggling for power, etc., this is not comforting. So,
but you know what? I completely agree with that. But I don't think what Fazlur Rahman is talking about in terms of his Quranic methodology.
That's
look,
different.
this is not about the past being comfortable, or this is the book, and this is how we can understand it. And you can understand it. There is he deeply believes there is a Quranic worldview. There are Quranic principles. The challenge is that how can we just read this text that everyone has in a way that extracts those principles? So, if there were theoretically schools of Islamic learning that would use his methodology and would train imams, and then so their khutbahs and their books and their interactions with Muslims would be a reflection of this Quranic method. I think there's nothing inherently controversial, or, it's controversial in the sense that people who have a different interpretation won't like it, but it's certainly an approach to the text that can easily be extracted if you just approach it in a different way. And it has, I think, a lot of relevance, and in many ways it will help promote greater ethics in Muslim societies. But that really requires, someone with a lot of money who can promote schools of learning around this particular approach, and can then provide a different, exposure to Muslims growing up, which...
But there is no alternative access for imams, or currently this situation now in Malaysia. It's all...
These imams are all trained in the Arab world, right? So, and the Arab world has nothing to do with this, because these books, we don't probably have So there's...
you can't expect any change to happen pretty soon,
Of course, change will happen soon in Malaysia.
It's
because
not...
the space for that change is not there at all.
Sorry, go ahead. Let's go some questions.
Actually, your comments are interesting, because I studied history textbooks, and part of it is about Islam's history, right?
Yeah.
But it's not just Islam's history, but even about the history of Tanah Melayu and so on. They tend to idealize. And the discourse is like, these rulers, when they convert to Islam, then it's all good. And only a good ruler will do well. And it's very normative.
Selective as well.
Yeah, and actually I read Badaruddin, Shaharuddin Badaruddin. He used the word euphoria. Not euphoria, utopia, sorry. Utopic way of looking at history. So it's not talking about historical reality. It's talking about, if it is the ideal, how it is like. So it seems to me that it is this way of worldview is influencing even how I believe it's not just history that is taught like that. I remember there was one forum where we were talking about the problem of Islam and nation building and things. One IKIM scholar was saying we should talk about what is good, what is positive, rather than criticizing. It's a similar thing. We tend to try to encourage people to look at ideals and not the reality, the complexity, and I think it's linked to also how we teach history and how we,
It probably is related to what you're trying to say. My question is this: regardless of this alternative interpretation, right? Doesn't the modernization of our society and the impact from different culture enough to create tension for Muslim to find relevance in the traditional way, right? The traditional interpretation. Do they actually still find relevance, or there is a tension that they cannot understand? For example, I once talked to my Muslim colleague about why there is a need for hudud law, for example, or is it fair in the Islam court that a female witness is treated not as equal as a male witness? So I mean, these kind of questions, shouldn't it already create some tension based on that current modernized living experience, personal experience?
I think it does. I mean, I remember, I think a lot of people, at least from my experience growing up, they can see that there's a tension in terms of their innate sense of commitment to equality, and a sense of, you know, what the modern sort of expectation is for how people should be treated. But at the same time, Muslims want to be committed to their religious identity. And the religious identity is one where the interpretation of that identity isn't done in a traditional way. So for example, if you read one of the, you know, the books that I actually teach, Social Justice in Islam by Sayyid Qutb, you know, where he deals precisely with this issue, where he tries to say that, look, the Quran is about human equality, men and women are equal, but there are these verses, inheritance, female witness, that clearly in the text mandate a double standard, one for men, one for women. And so he tries to engage in these interpretive gymnastics that say, yes, we believe in equality, but there are these exceptions. And then rather than trying to do the heavy job that Fazlur Rahman does, the traditional understanding by some of these modernist scholars who are in a different modernist track than Fazlur Rahman is to try and justify and provide arguments that justify effectively inequality, while at the same time saying, yes, you know, this argument that your men and women are, you know, Islam believes in equality, but in some areas there are these differences, and there's reasons why there are differences. And there's a justification, an attempt to justify the double standards, rather than trying to do what's much more difficult, come up with a new interpretation that doesn't justify difference or inequality, but that tries to, you know, but doing that is incredibly difficult because you're going up against a weight of traditional opinion that has been, you know, that is so authoritative that if you come up and try and, you know, come up with a different interpretation, the argument will, well, who the heck are you? What are your credentials to speak on this? You know, this is the text. So there's a certain literalist, you know, dominance that exists. And so I know from my experience growing up, you would, you know, a lot of people will, I think, just not publicly articulate their inner grievances. They would say, look, you know, I mean, they will know that there's clearly a double standard, and but they would try and just either not talk about it, or they would try and justify it in ways that would convince themselves. But, you know, this speaks to the immense difficult challenge of trying to reinterpret a tradition that goes back 1,500 years. And that there's a sense that not everyone is qualified to interpret that in tradition. You have to be specially trained. So there are these, you know, tensions that exist and that people are aware of, particularly in the modern societies of the West. I'm talking about my experience, not people in the Arab world, let's say, or in Iran or in other places, but people who are very much raised in a modern context. And what's actually interesting, you sort of see these things that are quite evident in my experience. You have people who live a modern lifestyle. They go to work, they're professionals, they have female colleagues, they have male colleagues, everyone is treated equally. But as soon as you go into the mosque, you undergo this almost transformation. Women at the back, women through a different door. You would never do that in your work setting. You'd be fired. But you think that this is just the way things are. And there's some sort of value to this. So you have this, you know, there was a story actually that Khalid Abu Fadl tells in one of his books where he went to this mosque in the United States to give a talk. And he was speaking in a sort of modernist way. And as soon as he started speaking, this one man, who was one of the leaders of the mosque, stands up and says, wait a second, we have to stop the lecture. Women and men are too mixed. We have to put the women behind a partition. We can't have the women. He was really passionate about this. And Khalid was a guest. The speaker was a guest. He didn't like what was happening, but he didn't want to offend. He thought that was just the way. And then this person is really sort of insistent, so they stop the event. Women are sort of... And then at the end of the event, he asks his colleague, who is this guy who's making so much commotion about women being separate and not having them mixing? And they said, oh, he's one of the leaders of the community, and he's a doctor in town, and he happens to be a gynecologist.
I remember that.
Do you
That's from
remember that? So here's a guy who in his professional life is a gynecologist, but in the mosque he's obsessed with female peasants. So this type of thing, I mean, that's just one example, but it speaks to a deeper problem. So there is this, I mean, people have schizophrenic, inconsistent, approaches. The challenge is to try and, not have that happen, but it's often, unfortunately, a more common occurrence than you realize.
That story was narrated in his book, Talking on the Name of God.
Yeah.
Which is already translated, Speaking in the Name of God.
Yeah.
Which is already translated, titled Bercakap atas nama Tuhan in Malaysia. Remember that? But just to respond briefly on your comment about Muslim, do they have like some kind of crisis when it comes to they think about this separate situation on matters like witness for women? The way I see it, one way is this goes back to Prof. Nadir's earlier point about Fazlur Rahman's important part, which is Fazlur Rahman emphasized on understanding religion rationally. This is not something which is being emphasized here in Malaysia, or even I would put in the mainstream Muslims' understanding. We are not being taught to understand religion or Islam rationally. So you need to, if you want to understand religion rationally, as IRF does, you need to take one step further, which is not going to be easy, because a lot of doctrines and teachings, most of them, we are not being trained to understand things rationally. So for Malaysians in general, when we are not being trained or we are not being taught to understand matters of religion rationally, it's very simple, and everything when it comes to religion, you don't need to understand it rationally, you just accept. You just take it as it is. If you start to want to understand things rationally, then we will be the one having something to take back, to have that kind of contradiction in views. But I want to ask Prof. Nadir again, just to end up related to this question as well. We understand now, in Western countries, in Europe, in America, these are where Islam is growing. Okay? I would have some sense that for Islam to grow in countries, in Western countries, which already have this process of secularization, of rational thinking and everything, it would be a lot easier for ideas of Islam coming from people like Fazlur Rahman and the other more modern thinkers would be accepted easier rather than the views coming from the Middle East, or in fact coming from Malaysia, because the setting of thinking is already different. But I think that is not actually the case.
Yeah, it's not. Look, if you go to any mosque in the United States or Canada, you have an imam that's there. That imam has been trained in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Pakistan. So he brings that to the mosque, and he preaches that traditional interpretation. Now, young people raised in a secular modern context, and they go to school, when they go and they hear that imam, they have problems with him. That's why if you go to most of the mosques today, most young people, they're not in the mosques. Okay, I mean they're taken as young, but most of them believe it's mostly elderly people. It's mostly immigrants that are sustaining the mosques. Young people, particularly those that end up in the social science and humanities, go to the mosque and they hear a discourse that is very alienating. So theoretically, I think Fazlur Rahman's interpretation would have a lot of interest and appeal, but the situation in Muslim spaces in North America is still dominated by authority figures who are trained in the Arab and Islamic world and come over and perform this type of. So even if I can't think of any bookstore in the United States that sells or promotes Fazlur Rahman's work. You can buy it on the internet, you can buy the university bookstores, but most of the bookstores and Islamic stores promote a traditional set of books, or books that are influenced by a Wahhabi Salafi narrative. Fazlur Rahman is just not there. But the potential, if that your question is, the potential, I think, of young people being open to this particular interpretation is there, because I think it provides a fresh, ethical, modern, humanistic, it will appeal to those Muslims that are interested in preserving their Islamic identity, but also are very alienated by the traditional Islam that they see in the mosque, and they're looking for something fresh. And so if you could expose it to them, I think it would be of huge appeal. And in fact, that's my story, and the story of my community of young people who are interested in, you know, Islam and its modernist interpretation. But again, you know, you need institutions, you need associations, and most of the you know, community centers and mosques are shaped by this traditional and very, you know, because a lot of people for religion, and I think this speaks to your question, a lot of people are interested in rational, morally consistent religion. They're interested in just feeling good.
Yeah.
They're interested in creating, I mean, many of the mosques in the United States are really attempts by immigrant communities to create an atmosphere that they're familiar with back home. A little, and most of the mosques are actually based on ethnic and linguistics. So people want a mosque that's familiar with the way that they were raised, their grandfather was raised. They're not interested in mosques that are interested in deep intellectual engagement and critique and reinterpretation. In fact, that's scary. That, I mean, because the argument is that if you engage in, then people may leave Islam. They may give up. And oh my God, then that's the end of everything, right? So there's a deep resistance to critique and to reinterpretation. Because one of the arguments is that we don't want to reinterpret or engage in rational consistency, because what happens if we promote people to leave the religion? And what they're actually in, you know, and so this is part of the dynamics that exist, you know, in North America. But you know, I think one thing that can be done, my own view, in terms of why Fazlur Rahman in the context of the Islamic Renaissance Front is such a good fit, because I think in many ways, had Fazlur Rahman lived today, he would have felt the pain that many of us feel about the global Muslim condition. I think, but he also would have been quite inspired by what the Renaissance Front, Islamic Renaissance Front, is trying to do in terms of providing an ethical, modern, inclusive, egalitarian, you know, interpretation of Islam. And in many ways, it's what his entire project was about. So I think he would be quite inspired, and I think that's where Fazlur Rahman's, I think, writings really can be resurrected and then promoted. It's through organizations such as the Islamic Renaissance Front and equivalent organizations in other parts of the Muslim world, by translating his writings, disseminating and keeping his name alive, introducing him into the public sphere of debates. It's not going to change anything in our lifetime, right? Because you're going up against the weight of history, and you're going up against a lot of entrenched interests.
I'm wondering how the forces are perpetuating this paradigm, this theoretical ideologies, how they're being perpetuated today.
Well, I mean, one, it's not really, at one level, it's not a deliberate plan or project. It's just the weight of tradition and the weight of history, right? They have an advantage. This is what traditional Islam has bequeathed.
I think it was constructed.
Well, it was constructed.
It is a construct.
Yeah.
What we are experiencing today
Yeah.
is a construct which didn't originate from within.
Yeah.
It was an external force that actually, you know, if we consider ourselves in different nation states, and it was a global kind of approach, and we are witnessing this today, and we are living it. You see, so our narratives to bring in modern, to deal with issues of modernity, must take these forces into consideration, so that we can resolve these issues. You see. So that's why I'm thinking, what are these forces that is perpetuating the situation today?
Well, I think the one force that I think is a deliberate, modern effort and attempt that has political interest behind it, that is affecting Islam's interpretation in Malaysia and across the Muslim world, is the attempt by Saudi Arabia to produce a particular conservative interpretation of Islam. This is a global problem. I've read figures that $100 billion has been spent by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to produce.
Is it just money?
I think fundamentally it's money, but it's also, you know, Saudi Arabia is in a unique position because Saudi Arabia is the home of the holy places.
Custodians of the holy mosques.
They have a lot of money, they have an interest. They sent a delegation here not too long ago, and they went to Indonesia. There's a lot of Muslims here. This is the way that Saudi Arabia, I think, exports its soft power. And you can see the effect. I can see the effect of Saudi Wahhabi Islam in Canada where I grew up. I'm old enough to remember that the mosque and the Muslim community that I grew up with in the 1970s is a very different community back then than it is today. In the 1970s, you had a traditional community of immigrants. People came, they met. It was very multicultural. It was very, open. You had Muslims from all over the world. I remember growing up in a community where you had Muslims from Bosnia, Muslims from the Arab world. My parents came from Iran. We were a minority Shia community. No one ever told us, you're Shia, don't come to the mosque. My parents didn't feel alienated. The question of sectarianism was not even on the agenda. And I know that because our family was and I went to an Islamic school where all my teachers were Sunni. There was a recognition that there was these differences, but there was never this hostility that you see today. Go to the 80s, you start to see a new wave coming in, a new set of interpretations, a new dogma, a new intolerance, a new obsession with Shias, a new obsession with women, a new obsession with things that you've never heard before. Like, for example, in the mosque that we grew up, you had a mosque, you had a door, everyone would go in. All of a sudden someone comes in and says, wait a second, why are women and men using the same door? Maybe there can be some sexual flirtation and things coming in. Astaghfirullah, brother, we need a separate. All of a sudden you need, then these debates about, separate, women have to be separate. Growing up in the 70s that I remember, there was none of this thing, none of this going on. This is coming in, it's not exclusively a Saudi Wahhabi thing. I think overwhelmingly it's because in Shia mosques that I'm familiar with, you do have a separate sort of dynamic of an attempt to regulate men and women's space in ways that are very rigid and very exclusive. But I think a big part of what we're seeing today globally is the spread of a particular puritanical and intolerant interpretation of Islam that has its roots in the theological interpretations of Saudi Arabia. And it takes place, the 1970s is a major turning point. It's the attempt by the Saudis to try and push back against the fear of revolutionary Islam coming out of Iran, and so they really invest heavily in these fatwas and these interpretations that are anti-Shia. I mean, you have to, actually I just edited a book on the question of sectarianism. One of the questions that we ask in the book is, why does sectarianism emerge as a force of conflict and tension at this point in Islamic history, but not before? And if you look at the history of sectarian tensions, you can trace it to a date, 1979. That's when you begin to see that. Before then, there were no tensions. What happens in 1979? Were there political interests that are involved in stoking this type of tension? And so that's a particular problem, and I think it's one that has very negative and corrosive effects. You can see it in the rise of ISIS. I mean, I was telling this story to someone that when ISIS sets up its so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria in 2014, they establish these schools, and they want textbooks. And of course, Amazon.com doesn't deliver to the Iraq-Syria border, so what do the ISIS theoreticians and leaders do? They go to the website and they download textbooks from the Department of Education in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Because those textbooks that are used in Saudi schools were the closest ideological overlap to what ISIS believed in. That's revealing, and it's that interpretation that in many ways has gone global. So this is one of the problems that you see in Europe and you see in Canada as well. If you're a young person and you want to discover something about your heritage, you go to the mosque and you go to the bookstore, the exposure that you're going to get is not Fazlur Rahman. It's going to get a traditional / Salafi Wahhabi interpretation that then produces. I mean, all of these. There's like 4,000 to 5,000 young European Muslims that have left Europe. It's actually quite revealing. They left Europe to go and join ISIS. Part of it has to do with their own personal psychology and their own mental, emotional problems. But part of it is because many of these young kids are exposed to this particular interpretation of Islam. That's the dominant one.
I remember when I went to a mosque in Bukit Lumpur. That's in Shah Alam. It was in 2012, 2013. And during the khutbah, they actually said that, we have to help our brothers in Syria, and we have to go and have jihad in Syria. So they were actually calling people to go to Syria because our Sunni brothers were being slayed.
Yeah.
So I mean, this sort of narrative, it has to originate from somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, so
No, there are political interests behind it, and
yeah, it's politicized. You see, so when you talk about this politicization of Islam, I mean, can't our leaders, I mean, think? You know,
Didn't Hishamuddin declare going to Jerusalem? That's your political leader.
Anyway, before perhaps Prof. Nadir would like to close with the last comments. Anyone else have like any comments or final questions? Because we're going to wrap up and close.
we're going to wrap up because I'm falling asleep.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Is there hope?
No, there is hope. You know where the hope is? The hope is in this meeting right here. The hope is in the Islamic Renaissance front. The hope is that, you know, there's a lot of Muslims around the world, and those ones that have the opportunity to think and meet, you know, have a general sense that, look, the condition of Muslims is quite bleak. These are the dark days of Islam, and we need to figure out a way out of this. I think the hope is that we still have people like, you know, Fazlur Rahman, who's not around with us, but his books are still here, and we're still, I mean, I don't know, I think he would be, I hope he would be if he was alive.
I thought there was an eminent persons group or something like that that was looking at issues like this.
Where?
Is there? I don't know. I'm questioning.
Here?
Not here. I think at a global level. Is there something that is happening?
The 50 most influential Muslims.
500.
500.
Yeah. I look at that list, you know. Yeah, I mean, it's not as bad as I thought it would be. You know, there is a list of people. They're prominent names.
Are they doing anything?
No. That group isn't. No. Individual Muslims are.
But that's you can't work on an individual level.
No.
You need to have at least an institution behind you.
Yeah.
What about that? Are there any institutions that can look
Islamic
at?
Renaissance.
I think just to end up so that we don't tend to be over pessimistic, if you can recall views, comments by Zaina just now, there are like continuous works being done by several organizations. In fact, I was just back from Indonesia. I see quite a lot of progress in Indonesia as well. Of course, we know one of the differences in Indonesia because they had their political reform in 1998, which after that there's further democratization. Of course, they are having their own problems. In fact, some of the problems are a lot more serious than what we are facing. But there are a lot of things which is happening that we in our own group say that there's actually good things happening. In fact, this is one of the goals of talking about what we are going to focus in the near future in IRF. We are also linking with the other organizations in other countries, mainly in Indonesia.
Yeah.
What we can learn from them, we would like to learn the lesson, and what are the things that they are also facing some difficulties. Some of them thinking of learning from Malaysia. So we say that there are things that you should not learn from Malaysia as well. Okay, I think anyway, because we're already like reaching like 10, more than 10 o'clock. I think I would finish the discussion. We had like a very interesting, not just discussion today, like a very long day of discussing Islam, justice, liberty, and of course the road more higher, which is discussed by Fazlur Rahman. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you everyone for joining our discussion online. Thanks again, Professor Nadir. And tomorrow there's going to be another session from Nadir in Nottingham University.
The last one.
Last session.
Last session.
Finally.
Last session. Finally.
Before you get arrested.
No, don't see that. No, 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock in Nottingham University. I don't want to repeat the topic again because I think I forgot again. Is there any relations between authoritarianism and religiosity? There's also
Religiosity and
religiosity and authoritarianism. Again, I got it next. Okay, hope to see you all again. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.